They chuckled softly, like it was just between them, but I heard every word. "You'll never be as good as your brother," my mother said, and my father let out a smug laugh. In that moment, something snapped inside me, a cold, sharp clarity I'd been burying for years. They'd said it before, countless times, but this time I refused to swallow it. My heart was pounding, my temples throbbed with every beat, but I didn't let them see me break. To them, this was a game. My brother was the golden child, and I was the shadow. What they didn't realize was that shadows see everything. Behind the polished surface of his so-called success, I knew truths they couldn't even imagine. They thought I would stay quiet, like always. That I would keep absorbing their barbed comments, playing the role of the compliant daughter who knew her place. But not tonight. Tonight I stood up and met their eyes. My smile was calm, but it carried ice. And then I said the words they never expected to hear. Growing up in my house was like living in a play where the script had been written long before I was born, and my role was carved out with ruthless precision. I was the background character, while my brother, Daniel, was the star. From the moment he learned to walk, he was showered with applause, and every stumble of mine was met with raised eyebrows and that same infuriating chuckle. Birthdays were his stage, Christmases his spotlight, and even the smallest achievements, a passing grade, a basketball shot, a compliment from a teacher, were framed and celebrated like national holidays. Mine? They were brushed aside with a nod, a distracted, "That's fine," or worse, compared against him until any sense of pride crumbled to dust. When I was 16, I won a regional essay competition. My name was printed in the local paper. My teacher hugged me with tears in her eyes. But when I came home with the clipping clutched in my hand, my father barely glanced at it. He folded the paper, laid it next to his coffee, and said, "Not bad. Your brother just got recruited to varsity. Now that's something to be proud of." I remember the way my throat tightened, how my mother chimed in with, "Well, writing won't put food on the table, will it?" They didn't see how the words crushed me, how I went to my room and tore that newspaper into shreds until my fingers bled from the edges of the paper. That was the story of my life. Invisible effort, invisible pain, while my brother's every move was broadcast as proof of his brilliance. He wasn't cruel, not in the way they were, but he basked in it. And sometimes I wondered if he even noticed how much space he took up, how little oxygen they left for me. When college came, they didn't ask me what I wanted. They told me straight out, "Stay close to home. Daniel will need the car. You can take the bus." And I did. I complied, because back then standing up felt impossible. I worked 2 part-time jobs while studying, dragging myself through long nights, knowing there would be no recognition waiting at the dinner table. Daniel came home on weekends with stories of fraternity parties, internships, professors who adored him, and my parents would lean in, drinking every word like wine. Meanwhile, I was the one who cleaned the kitchen, paid the phone bills when they forgot, and patched holes in a life they didn't even bother to notice. It wasn't just favoritism, it was erasure. Every photograph on the mantel was of Daniel. Every anecdote at family gatherings began with his name. And every look in their eyes told me, without words, that I was filler. And yet, through it all, I watched. I learned. I gathered the truth they refused to see. I learned that the perfect son had cracks, that behind his confident stories there were debts, failures, and secrets he worked hard to bury. And I carried those truths quietly, storing them like kindling, knowing that one day, when they least expected it, the match would strike. It all started unraveling the year I turned 27, because by then the imbalance wasn't just an old wound, it was bleeding into every corner of my adult life. I'd finally landed a job that I loved, one that didn't just pay bills but gave me a sense of worth. Yet when I mentioned it over dinner, my father barely looked up from his plate before asking, "But how does that compare to Daniel's promotion?" My mother added, "He just bought a new car, did you hear?" Such a proud moment. The car, by the way, was financed almost entirely by them, but that detail never mattered. I had bought my own used hatchback with my savings, no handouts, no co-signers, but of course that was invisible. That was always the story. I did things alone, they did things for him, and still he came out the hero. The trigger came on a Sunday afternoon when the family gathered in our living room. My parents had invited neighbors, relatives, even distant cousins. The house was filled with the smell of roast beef, the clatter of dishes, and the sound of Daniel talking loudly about his upcoming investment deal. He waved his hands, spun grand promises, bragged about figures he clearly didn't have. I sat in the corner, sipping water, listening carefully, and then it happened. My father raised his glass and said loudly, "To Daniel, who has always been our pride, our proof that hard work pays off. We are so blessed." My mother leaned in, smiled at me in front of everyone, and said those same words she'd been saying my entire life. "You'll never be as good as your brother." The room chuckled, some politely, some awkwardly, but the sting was sharp. In that instant, something inside me shifted. It wasn't shame anymore. It was fury, cold and steady. I stood, my chair scraping against the floor, every pair of eyes snapping toward me. My brother smirked like he'd heard this routine 1,000 times, like he expected me to swallow it again. But I didn't. I looked straight at my parents, at the smugness on their faces, and I let the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. Then, with a calm voice that carried more weight than shouting ever could, I said, "Then tell him to prove it." The room fell silent. Daniel's smirk faltered. My father's glass froze halfway to his lips, and my mother blinked like she hadn't heard me correctly. But I repeated it, louder this time, each word deliberate. "If he's so much better, tell him to prove it. Right here, right now." And that was the moment the ground shifted beneath their perfect little script. The silence that followed my words was heavier than anything I'd felt in that house before. For the first time in my life, my parents didn't have a ready laugh or a cutting remark. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. My father frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the challenge. And Daniel shifted in his chair, no longer smirking, but staring at me like I had just ruined his performance. That was when I realized the power wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. I walked to the sideboard where my bag was resting, unzipped it, and pulled out a folder I had been carrying for weeks. Inside were printouts, bank statements, emails, screenshots, receipts that I had been collecting quietly, watching as Daniel built his life on borrowed money, unpaid credit cards, and false promises. I never planned to use them at first, but something deep inside me always knew the day would come when their perfect son would finally face the truth. I spread the papers on the table slowly, methodically, so that everyone in that living room, our aunts, uncles, neighbors, even the family friends who had come only to drink wine and nod along, could see. "You say I'll never be as good as him?" I said steadily. "Then explain these. Explain the debt collector's calling at midnight. Explain the internship he claimed he earned when it was my research project he plagiarized. Explain how he's been using your credit card for months while you brag about his independence." My father's face flushed deep red. My mother's hand trembled as she tried to gather the papers. And Daniel jumped up, stammering, it's not what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just stood there, calm and cold, watching as the image they had built around him cracked wide open. "Better," I repeated, my voice low but steady. "If better means lying, stealing, and hiding, then maybe you're right. Maybe I'll never be that. And thank God for it." The whispers started immediately, the relatives shifting uncomfortably, the neighbors exchanging glances. The golden boy's shine had dulled in an instant, and there was no taking it back. The pushback came fast, sharper than I even expected. My mother's voice cracked first, trembling with indignation. "How dare you embarrass this family in front of everyone? What kind of daughter airs private matters like dirty laundry?" My father slammed his hand on the table, his glass tipping and spilling wine across the papers, as if drowning the evidence could erase it. "Enough," he barked, but his eyes weren't on me. They were darting nervously between the relatives, scanning for judgment, trying desperately to control the story. Daniel stepped forward, his tone switching instantly to defense. "She's exaggerating, twisting things like she always does. You know how jealous she's been since we were kids. She wants to drag me down because she can't stand my success." The word jealous echoed through the room, and I could see some of the guests shift uncomfortably, unsure of what to believe. Gaslighting. That was their favorite weapon. My mother clutched her pearls, shaking her head. "You're sick with envy? We raised you better than this." And I realized in that moment that they weren't worried about Daniel, not really. They were worried about appearances. Their golden boy was their mask, their trophy, the proof they clung to that they had done everything right. If his shine dimmed, so did theirs. I didn't let their words pierce me the way they used to. Instead, I looked at the crowd, the people who had just seen the evidence with their own eyes. "You can believe what you want," I said calmly, my voice cutting through the noise. But truth doesn't vanish just because it's inconvenient. Daniel tried to snatch the papers, his hand shaking, but I pulled them back and slipped them into my folder. "No more lies," I said, staring directly at him. The neighbors, who had always idolized my parents' version of success, were already whispering, their eyes darting between Daniel's pale face and my steady stance. The perfect family picture was collapsing in real time, and no amount of shouting could paint it over. My father hissed at me, low enough that only I could hear, "You'll regret this." But for the first time in my life, I didn't believe him. The consequences didn't wait. They arrived like a storm the very next morning. By dawn, the whispers from that dinner had already spread across our small town, leaking from one neighbor to another, until half the community was buzzing about how the golden boy wasn't so golden after all. By the time I got to work, 2 coworkers had already mentioned hearing something about Daniel's money issues. That was how fast it traveled, and I knew my parents could feel their carefully constructed facade crumbling with every passing hour. My phone lit up with calls from my mother first, one after another, each voicemail angrier than the last. "You've ruined your brother's reputation. You've humiliated us. Do you understand what you've done?" Then my father, his tone colder, quieter, laced with warning. "You think you've won something here? You've only made enemies." I didn't answer either of them. For once, silence was my weapon. Daniel, though, was the loudest. He showed up at my apartment unannounced, pounding on the door, demanding I let him in. When I finally cracked it open, his face was red, eyes bloodshot, and his words tumbled out fast. "You don't understand. You think you're clever, but you've destroyed me. Do you know what people are saying? Do you know what this will do to my career?" His career, the one propped up on lies and borrowed money. I stood there in the doorway, my arms crossed, my voice flat. All I did was hold up a mirror, "Daniel. You destroyed yourself." He begged then, switching tactics, the anger giving way to desperation. "Please, you have to fix this. Tell them you exaggerated. Tell them it was just a mistake." His voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before, but I didn't flinch. "No," I said, and I closed the door slowly, the sound of the latch clicking louder in that moment than his frantic knocking that followed. And that was the truth. The lies were no longer mine to carry. And for the first time, the weight was shifting back where it belonged. What came after was uglier than I imagined. Because when people lose control of their narrative, they claw at anything they can to salvage it. My parents doubled down, calling relatives, insisting I had fabricated everything out of spite. They said I had always been bitter, always trying to outshine Daniel, that I must have doctored the papers. But the thing about evidence is that it leaves a trail, and people had already started to verify it for themselves. One of my uncles, who worked in finance, pulled me aside days later with a heavy look. "I checked," he said quietly. "Every word you said is true. They can't spin this away." Still, my parents tried. They showed up at my apartment, knocking until my neighbors stared through their peepholes. My mother cried, clutching her chest, wailing about betrayal. My father growled about loyalty and family duty. But none of it was about me. It was about preserving the image of Daniel as their masterpiece. They needed me silent because my voice made cracks they couldn't plaster over. And Daniel himself, stripped of his shine, turned vicious. Text after text, call after call, accusing me of ruining his future, threatening lawsuits, swearing he'd make sure I was left with nothing. But here's the part that none of them understood. I wasn't afraid anymore. I had lived in their shadow for so long that stepping into the light felt like oxygen for the first time. Every attempt to intimidate me only proved how weak they really were when the truth stood against them. And with every passing day, people began to look at me differently. Not as the jealous sister, not as the invisible daughter, but as the one who finally spoke up. That shift, that quiet recognition, was more powerful than all their shouting combined. The fallout spread beyond whispers and family drama. It seeped into every layer of their lives. My father, once the man who bragged about Daniel at church gatherings and town meetings, suddenly found himself dodging questions he couldn't answer. The proud stories dried up, replaced with mutters and excuses. My mother, who loved to post photos online of Daniel's successes, quietly deleted half of them within a week. Their golden child was no longer untouchable, and they hated me for exposing it. But the truth had momentum now. Creditors started calling the house directly, no longer content with unanswered emails. One even showed up at their door, a stern man in a suit with paperwork in hand, demanding to speak with Daniel. I wasn't there, But I heard later from a cousin that my mother nearly fainted when the word default was mentioned. Daniel himself spiraled. He tried to get ahead of the story, telling friends that I had hacked his accounts, that I had always been unstable. But the more he spoke, the less convincing he sounded, especially when those same friends began receiving messages from people he owed money to, people who weren't shy about sharing details. I didn't need to lift another finger. The lies were unraveling faster than he could patch them. Still, my parents clung to him. They begged me to retract everything, to call people and admit I had exaggerated. "We are family," my mother pleaded on the phone one night, her voice shaking. Families protect each other. I let the silence stretch before I answered, and when I finally spoke, my voice was steady. Families don't sacrifice one child to worship another. "I'm done playing that role," she sobbed, accused me of tearing us apart, but the truth was it had been broken for years. I was only refusing to hold the pieces together anymore. Daniel showed up again, this time not angry, but hollow, eyes sunken, clothes wrinkled like he hadn't slept. He slumped against my doorway, whispering, "You've ruined me." I looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time, I didn't feel small in his presence. "No," I said quietly. "You ruined yourself. I just stopped covering for you." And then I closed the door. Then came the moment I had been preparing for without even realizing it. The day I drew the line and made it permanent. A certified letter arrived at my apartment. Thick with legal jargon, but clear in its intent. Daniel was trying to shift some of his debt onto me, claiming shared responsibility through old accounts my parents had once signed in my name when I was barely 18. It was their last attempt to keep me bound, their final trick to make me carry the weight of his failures. In the past, I might have panicked, begged them to fix it, tried to smooth things over. But not this time. I took the letter straight to an attorney, laid out the folder I'd been keeping, every document, every receipt, every time-stamped proof of what had really been going on. The attorney looked through it carefully, then leaned back and said words I'll never forget. "You don't just have a defense. You have a case." For once, the power was on my side, backed not by emotion but by facts carved into paper and ink. Within weeks, I filed motions to clear my name from any of Daniel's financial mess. And not only that, I requested damages for the fraudulent use of my identity. My parents were livid. My father stormed into my workplace, demanding I drop it, shouting about how I was destroying the family name. My mother cried about reputations, about how no one would ever look at us the same. But I didn't back down. I stood in that lobby in front of my coworkers and strangers alike and told him calmly, if you wanted a perfect family, you shouldn't have built it on lies. He left red-faced, my mother trailing after him, but the damage was irreversible. And Daniel, he crumbled in court. Every lie, every hidden bill, every borrowed dollar came to light under questioning, and for once there was no one left to shield him. The judge dismissed every claim against me and ordered him to take full responsibility for his debts. Watching his face as the gavel came down was the closest thing to justice I had ever tasted. That night, I sat in my small apartment, the folder finally closed, the weight gone from my shoulders. I thought about all the years I spent swallowing their words, letting them define me by what I wasn't. And then, slowly it hit me. They could chuckle, they could sneer, they could build Daniel up on a throne of sand, but none of it mattered anymore. I had stepped out of their shadow, and I wasn't going back. From that day forward, I cut off contact. No calls, no visits, no explanations. The silence was my revenge, louder than any argument, sharper than any insult. And in that silence, I finally found peace. The silence I imposed wasn't just an act of rebellion, it became a shield, and soon it transformed into freedom. Days turned into weeks, and for the first time in my life, I didn't wake up with my parents' voices echoing in my head, telling me I wasn't enough. Instead, I woke up to quiet mornings, coffee brewed in my own kitchen, walls that held no judgment, and the realization that I was finally living on my own terms. My parents tried, of course. They sent letters dripping with guilt, emails filled with half apologies twisted into accusations, even messages through relatives claiming that Daniel was falling apart without my support. But each time, I deleted, shredded, ignored. Their desperation only proved how much they relied on me to keep their fantasy intact, and the more they clawed, the more distance I built. And Daniel, he didn't recover the way they had hoped. With creditors closing in and his reputation in shambles, he bounced between excuses, blaming the economy, bad luck, even me. but the town had seen too much to believe him. He lost the promotion he'd bragged about, friends drifted away, and soon he was just another man scrambling in the wreckage of his own lies. People began to look at me differently, not with pity, but with respect. At work, my manager asked if I'd considered taking on a leadership role. Neighbors who once ignored me now stopped to chat, quietly admitting they admired how I'd stood my ground. Even relatives who had laughed at my parents' jokes started calling me privately, whispering, "You were right all along." It was strange, the way the world shifted once I stopped shrinking myself to fit their story. Yet the greatest shift was inside me. I didn't feel the constant urge to prove myself anymore. I no longer measured my worth against Daniel's shadow. I was no longer the forgotten daughter or the scapegoat sister. I was simply me, standing on my own, and that was finally enough. As the months passed, the distance between us grew into something unbridgeable, and for once, I wasn't the one trying to close the gap. My parents still clung to Daniel like he was their last lifeline, even as his world fell apart piece by piece. He moved back into their house, drowning in debt collectors and broken promises, and suddenly the golden boy they once paraded became their burden. I heard about the shouting matches through cousins, how he snapped at them when they asked for money he no longer had, how my father's temper exploded when the bank threatened foreclosure, how my mother cried at night because the neighbors who once envied her now avoided her eyes. They tried one last tactic, painting me as the villain to anyone who would listen, telling relatives that I had betrayed my family, that I had chosen strangers over blood. But it didn't work anymore. People had seen the cracks for themselves, and the truth had a way of seeping through no matter how many lies they tried to patch it with. What struck me most was how little it all hurt now. Once their rejection would have shattered me, sent me spiraling into self-doubt. But now it barely registered. I'd built something outside their reach, friends who valued me for who I was, colleagues who respected me, a life that wasn't tethered to their endless comparisons. Every time I walked past a mirror, I saw someone different. Not the shadow of Daniel, not the forgotten child, but a woman who had survived their contempt and carved out her own name. And yet, I couldn't help but notice the irony. All those years they spent telling me I'd never be as good as him, and now it was Daniel leaning on them, draining them, dragging them down while I stood free. That bitter symmetry was its own kind of justice, quiet but undeniable, and I didn't need to lift a finger to make it happen. I remember the exact day I realized there was no going back. It was late autumn, the air sharp with the kind of chill that hinted at winter, and I was walking through town when I saw them, my parents, arm in arm with Daniel trailing behind like a ghost of the man they once flaunted. His suit was wrinkled, his eyes downcast, and they looked older than I'd ever seen them. Their posture no longer proud, but weighed down by something heavier than age. They spotted me across the street, and for a flicker of a moment, my mother's face lit with a desperate kind of hope, the way someone drowning might stretch for a hand. But I didn't cross. I didn't smile. I kept walking, steady, calm, knowing they had nothing left to offer me but the same poisoned love that had defined my childhood. That night, they called again, not with anger this time, but with pleading. My mother's voice cracked as she said, "We need you. We can't manage without you." In the end, what struck me most was not their downfall, but my freedom. For years, I thought revenge would mean standing over them as they begged, watching them admit I had always been enough. But when the moment finally came, I didn't need their confession, because the truth had already written itself in the way their lives collapsed without me. I heard through a cousin that they lost the house, that Daniel moved into a dingy apartment 2 towns over, that my father's health faltered under the weight of stress, and my mother rarely left the house anymore because she couldn't face the neighbors she once bragged to. The irony was brutal. They had poured everything into Daniel, insisting he was the better one, and now he was the anchor dragging them down. And yet I didn't feel triumph watching them sink. I felt clarity. They had chained me to their comparisons for so long that breaking free felt less like a victory, and more like reclaiming air I should have been breathing all along. The revenge wasn't in their suffering, it was in the fact that I no longer carried it. My life stretched wide before me, unshackled. I took trips I once thought I'd never deserve, invested in my career until it flourished, built friendships that fed me instead of drained me. Every milestone I reached on my own terms was another nail in the coffin of their old narrative. I didn't need their applause. I didn't need their approval. And I certainly didn't need their chuckles echoing in my head anymore. One evening, sitting on my balcony with the sun bleeding orange over the horizon, I thought about the little girl I used to be, the one who sat at the dinner table, newspaper clipping in hand, waiting for someone to say, "We're proud of you." She never got it. But now I could whisper it to her myself. I am proud of you. I am enough. And I will never again let anyone measure me against someone else's shadow. My parents chuckled, "You'll never be as good as your brother?" Maybe once those words caged me. But now, they're nothing but an echo. And I am the one who walked away, free. So tell me, was I wrong to cut them out for good? Or did I finally do what should have been done years ago?